Marcus Rodriguez had always been told he was built like a tank, so naturally everyone at the Galactic Military Academy called him exactly that. Tank. Not particularly creative, but then again, neither was the Academy's approach to integrating the first human into their supposedly elite training program. "Another stellar performance, Tank," muttered Zorb, his 8 tentacles writhing in what Tank had learned was the cephalopod equivalent of eye-rolling. "I particularly enjoyed the part where you asked if we could just shoot the training simulation instead of analyzing its behavioral patterns for 6 hours. Tank shrugged, adjusting his uniform that never quite fit right among all the custom-tailored alien gear. "Seemed practical to me. Dead enemies don't have behavioral patterns." The crystalline being beside him chimed softly, which meant Nala was either laughing or preparing to shatter from secondhand embarrassment, hard to tell with her species. "That is precisely the kind of thinking that landed you in remedial tactical theory, Tank." "Hey, I passed remedial tactical theory," Tank protested, dropping into his seat as the other students filed into the advanced combat training facility. The room buzzed with conversations in 17 different languages, none of which involved actual buzzing except for Clix, whose mandibles clicked in perpetual irritation. "You passed because Instructor Vex got tired of failing you," Clix chittered, his insectoid features managing to convey disdain despite having compound eyes. "There is a difference between academic achievement and instructor exhaustion." Tank looked around the circular amphitheater that served as their main training hall. Holographic displays showed rotating diagrams of various death-dealing scenarios, because apparently that was considered motivational. The other students represented the finest military minds from across the galaxy. Zorb could calculate battlefield trajectories in his sleep. Nala's crystalline structure literally resonated with tactical frequencies, whatever that meant. Clix had reflexes that made hummingbirds look sluggish. And then there was Tank, human, from Earth, the planet that had somehow convinced the Galactic Council they deserved a spot in the most prestigious military academy in known space, despite having only just figured out faster-than-light travel, and still arguing about whether pineapple belonged on pizza. The lights dimmed, and Drill Instructor Vex materialized at the center of the room. Well, not literally materialized. That would have been impressive. Instead, he just walked out from behind a hologram projector like a normal person, which was somehow more terrifying. Vex belonged to a species that looked like someone had crossbred a rhinoceros with a very angry philosophy professor. His scarred hide told stories of battles Tank couldn't pronounce, and his 4 eyes seemed permanently fixed in an expression that suggested he'd rather be literally anywhere else. "Greetings, future disappointments," Vex announced, his voice carrying the warm enthusiasm of a tax audit. "I trust you all completed the assigned reading on advanced xenobiology combat applications?" Tank glanced at his tablet, which definitely contained the assigned reading somewhere under the 17 tactical simulation games he'd downloaded. "Close enough. Today marks the beginning of your final examination period," Vex continued, each word delivered with the precision of a funeral director. "Over the next week, you will face challenges designed to test everything you have theoretically learned during your time here." Zorb's tentacles tightened slightly. Nala's crystalline structure shifted to a deeper blue, which Tank had learned meant concern. Click's mandibles stopped clicking entirely, never a good sign. Tank looked around at his classmates and wondered, not for the first time, how exactly Earth had talked its way into this situation. Sure, humans were persistent and adaptable and had that whole never-give-up thing going for them, but sitting in a room full of beings who could literally think faster, move quicker, and strategize better made him feel like he'd wandered into the wrong classroom. "Your final grades will depend entirely on practical application," Vex announced with the sort of smile that suggested he was already planning the memorial services. "No more simulations, no more theoretical exercises. Real challenges, real consequences." Tank raised his hand. "When you say real consequences, you mean like actually real? Or like Academy real, where we just get really disappointed if we mess up?" The silence that followed was the kind usually reserved for natural disasters in tax season. Vex's 4 eyes focused on Tank with the intensity of targeting computers. "Mr. Rodriguez," Vex said slowly, "I believe you are about to find out." Instructor Vex activated the central hologram, and suddenly the room filled with the 3-dimensional image of something that looked like evolution had gotten drunk and decided to combine a bear, a dragon, and someone's worst childhood nightmare. The creature stood 12 feet tall, covered in obsidian scales that seemed to absorb light, with claws that could probably open cans and also disembowel entire armies. "Behold, Vex announced with the dramatic flair of a game show host revealing the grand prize. The Dread Mauler of Proxima 9. Tank squinted at the hologram. Is that its actual name? Or did someone just really commit to the whole intimidating vibe? The Dread Mauler, Vex continued, pointedly ignoring Tank's question, is considered one of the most formidable predators in the known galaxy. It possesses adaptive camouflage, regenerative capabilities, and intelligence levels that rival most sentient species. Oh good, Tank muttered. It's smart and wants to eat us. Zorb's tentacles had gone completely pale, which was never encouraging. Instructor Vex, surely you don't mean we'll be facing an actual Dread Mauler, the mortality statistics alone. The Academy has maintained a specimen for training purposes for over 2 centuries, Vex replied cheerfully. It has been carefully contained and studied. We know its every behavioral pattern. How many students has it killed? Nyella asked, her crystalline structure now flashing a distinctly alarmed shade of red. Vex paused just long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. The Academy prefers the term educational casualties. That's not an answer, Clix chittered, his compound eyes reflecting the hologram in unsettling ways. That's a euphemism designed to avoid answering. The exact number is classified, Vex said, but I can tell you that the medical bay has been notified and is standing by with their best trauma team. Tank raised his hand again. Question. If this thing is supposedly contained and studied, why do we need a trauma team? Shouldn't we just, not get traumatized? The other students began sharing increasingly dramatic stories they'd heard about the Dread Mauler. Zorb mentioned a senior from 3 years ago who'd apparently developed such severe PTSD that he'd changed majors to galactic accounting. Nala recalled rumors about a crystallite student whose structure had literally cracked from fear before even entering the arena. Clix contributed a cheerful anecdote about an insectoid warrior who'd needed therapy for 6 months after seeing the creature's feeding routine. But surely, Zorb said, his tentacles writhing anxiously, there must be some sort of safety protocols? Protective barriers? Emergency extraction procedures? Vex's expression suggested he found the question amusing. Of course, we have a comprehensive safety protocol. Everyone waited. We make sure to spell your names correctly on the memorial plaques. Tank watched his classmates process this information, the room filled with the sounds of nervous tentacle whiffing, crystalline structure shifting, and mandible clicking that somehow harmonized into a symphony of barely contained panic. Now then, Vex continued, completely oblivious to, or possibly enjoying the growing horror, the exercise is quite simple. One volunteer will enter the containment arena with standard Academy equipment and demonstrate practical application of combat training against the Dread Mauler. Define demonstrate, Tank said. Survive for 10 minutes without being eaten, dismembered, or psychologically broken. And if we don't survive? Vex shrugged. Then you'll have provided valuable data about the creature's current hunting preferences. Tank looked around the room at his fellow students. Zorb was now so pale his tentacles were practically transparent. Nala's crystalline structure had shifted through several colors and was now pulsing in ominous purple. Clix had gone completely still, which in his species meant he was either deep in thought or preparing to molt from stress. There has to be some kind of strategy that works against this thing, Tank said. I mean, you've been studying it for 2 centuries. Someone must have figured out its weaknesses. Oh, absolutely, Vex replied. We've identified several potential vulnerabilities. Such as? Well, it does require oxygen to breathe. Tank waited for more information. None came. That's it? It needs air? We're also fairly certain it would be vulnerable to being launched into a star. Fairly certain? The research is ongoing. Tank realized that his casual question about real consequences was starting to feel less casual and more prophetic. Around him, the galaxy's finest military minds were beginning to understand that their final exam might also be their final exam, if you caught the distinction. So, Tank said slowly, someone actually has to volunteer for this. Indeed, Vex confirmed. One brave soul must step forward to face the Dread Mauler in single combat. The room fell silent except for the low hum of life support systems, and what sounded suspiciously like Clix praying in his native language. Tank looked around at his classmates and realized they were all having the same thought simultaneously. Somebody else should definitely volunteer for this. Excellent, Instructor Vex announced, clasping his hands together with the enthusiasm of someone about to watch a particularly entertaining disaster. Now then, who would like to volunteer for this educational opportunity? The silence stretched on for approximately 3 geological eras. Tank watched in fascination as the most advanced military minds in the galaxy suddenly discovered they had urgent business anywhere that wasn't here. It started subtly. Zor began examining his tentacles with intense scientific interest, as if he'd never seen them before. Nala's crystalline structure shifted to a shade that Tank was pretty sure meant, "Please don't perceive me." Click started grooming his antennae with the focus of someone performing brain surgery. "Come now," Vex said, his voice carrying the warm encouragement of a tax collector. "Surely one of you is eager to demonstrate your combat prowess." That's when the real creativity began. Zorb's tentacles suddenly began shedding what looked suspiciously like dandruff, except it was purple and glowed slightly. "Oh dear," he said, not sounding particularly distressed. "I'm afraid I'm molting. Terrible timing, really. My species becomes incredibly vulnerable during the molting process. One good scare could literally kill me." "You're not molting," Naala pointed out helpfully. "That's just stress discharge." "Stress molting," Zorb corrected quickly. "Much more dangerous than regular molting. Could be fatal if exposed to loud noises, sudden movements, or theoretical death machines." Vex's 4 eyes narrowed. "Mr. Zorb, you molted 3 weeks ago. Your species only molts twice per standard year." "Emergency molting," Zorb suggested hopefully. Click suddenly stood up, his exoskeleton making concerning clicking noises. "Actually, Instructor Vex, I've just remembered that my carapace is due for maintenance next week. Academy Regulation 847B clearly states that students with compromised structural integrity cannot participate in high-risk activities." "Your carapace looks fine to me," Vex observed. Clix began pointing to microscopic scratches on his exoskeleton with the dedication of an art critic examining a masterpiece. "You see this hairline fracture here, and this barely visible stress mark? One solid impact could cause catastrophic structural failure. I could literally fall apart." "Those are normal wear patterns." "Catastrophic wear patterns," Clix insisted. Nala's turn came next, and she really committed to the performance. Her entire crystalline structure began resonating at a frequency that made everyone's teeth hurt. "I'm afraid I cannot participate due to emotional crystalline instability," she announced, her voice creating harmonic echoes. "Exposure to extreme stress could cause my molecular structure to shatter irreversibly." "That's not a real medical condition," Vex said. "It is now," Nala replied, somehow managing to sound dignified while vibrating at frequencies that made the hologram projector flicker. Tank watched this display of creative cowardice with growing amazement. These were supposed to be the elite warriors of tomorrow, the best and brightest the galaxy had to offer, the individuals who would one day lead armies and defend entire civilizations. And they were all desperately trying to avoid facing one admittedly terrifying but ultimately just very large animal. "Perhaps," suggested a student from the back row who belonged to a species that looked like ambulatory cacti, "we could approach this challenge as a group exercise. Teamwork is an important military skill." "Absolutely not," Vex replied. "This is an individual assessment." "What if we drew straws?" offered another student. "What if we held a democratic vote?" suggested a third. "What if we just pretended this never happened and moved on to the written exam?" proposed Zorb hopefully. Vex's expression suggested he was rapidly losing faith in the future of galactic military leadership. "Ladies and gentlemen, you are supposed to be the finest military academy cadets in known space. This creature, while dangerous, is contained, studied, and manageable with proper training and equipment." "Then you fight it," muttered someone from the back. "I already have," Vex replied calmly. 17 times. That's how I got most of these scars." Tank looked around the room and realized something both hilarious and slightly disturbing. He was still sitting in the front row, while everyone else had been creating increasingly elaborate excuses and slowly edging toward the exits. He'd just been sitting there, watching the show, which meant he was now the only student still within volunteering distance of Instructor Vex. "Mr. Rodriguez," Vex said, his 4 eyes focusing on Tank with laser-like precision. Tank looked behind him at the sea of alien faces, all carefully avoiding eye contact and suddenly finding the ceiling architecture absolutely fascinating. "Yeah, it appears," Vex said with what might have been the first genuine smile Tank had seen from him, "that you're our volunteer." Tank looked around the room one more time, just to make absolutely sure he wasn't missing something obvious. Nope. Still the only one sitting in volunteer range while everyone else had somehow migrated to what could generously be called the Strategic Observation Zone, near the exits. Well, Tank said, standing up and stretching like he'd just volunteered to help move furniture instead of potentially become creature food. I guess that works. How hard can it be, right? The collective gasp from his classmates sounded like air being sucked out of a space station hull breach. Tank, no, Zorb said, his tentacles writhing in what Tank had learned was peak anxiety mode. You don't understand. This isn't just some large predator. This is the Dread Mauler. It has killed trained warriors from 17 different species. Yeah, but Tank shrugged. It's still just an animal, right? It eats, it sleeps, it probably poops somewhere. Animals have patterns, weaknesses, vital organs in predictable places. The room fell silent except for the sound of Click's mandibles clicking so fast it sounded like a Geiger counter near Chernobyl. Vital organs? Nala's crystalline structure flashed a color Tank was pretty sure meant existential horror. Tank, you can't just punch a Dread Mauler in its vital organs. Way not? Where are they? Instructor Vex, who had been watching this exchange with growing fascination, activated his datapad. The Dread Mauler's primary cardiovascular center is located approximately here, he said, highlighting a spot on the holographic display. However, it's protected by 3 inches of reinforced bone plating and surrounded by razor-sharp defensive spines. Tank squinted at the hologram, tilting his head like he was trying to solve a particularly interesting puzzle. Okay, so frontal assault on the heart is out. What about the brain? Multiple brain clusters distributed throughout the cranial cavity. Destroying one wouldn't necessarily be fatal. Lungs. Redundant respiratory systems. It can survive on partial lung function indefinitely. Joints, tendons, anything that bends. Vex paused, looking genuinely surprised by the question. Well, yes, standard articulation points in the appendages, but can it bleed? Of course it can bleed, but Tank, Zorb interrupted, his voice reaching pitches that probably violated several noise ordinances. Blood loss takes time. It will eat you long before it bleeds out. Tank was quiet for a moment, processing this information with the kind of methodical thinking that had gotten him through remedial tactical theory. So it's big, mean, smart, and tough, but it's not actually invincible. It just has really good armor and backup systems. That's a terrifyingly oversimplified analysis, Click chittered. Simple usually works, Tank replied. Complex plans fall apart when you're getting chased by something with more teeth than a hardware store. Tank, Nyala said, her structure now pulsing between concern purple and panic red. This isn't a simulation. If you get this wrong, you don't get to try again. You get to be digested. Yeah, I got that part. Tank looked genuinely puzzled by their concern. But people fight dangerous animals all the time. Humans have been doing it for thousands of years. Bears, tigers, sharks, angry geese. You find their weakness and exploit it. This isn't a goose, Zor protested. Same principle, bigger teeth. Instructor Vex had been unusually quiet during this exchange, but now he stepped forward with an expression Tank couldn't quite read. Mr. Rodriguez, I feel obligated to explain the safety protocols for this exercise. Okay, shoot. First, you'll be equipped with standard Academy combat gear. Energy weapon, personal shield generator, emergency beacon. Sounds reasonable. Second, the arena has reinforced observation windows where medical personnel will be standing by. Also reasonable. Third, if you become incapacitated, unconscious, or begin screaming in languages that don't exist, the emergency team will attempt extraction. Tank paused. Attempt? The Dread Mauler becomes somewhat aggressive when interrupted during feeding time. Right, and what exactly constitutes incapacitated? Like missing a limb, or more of a missing several vital organs situation? We play it by ear, Vex said cheerfully. Every case is unique. Tank looked around the room at his classmates, who were staring at him like he'd just volunteered to juggle live grenades while riding a unicycle through a minefield. Their expressions ranged from horrified concern to morbid fascination, with Zorb somewhere in the territory of preparing to plan Tank's memorial service. You know what the really weird part is? Tank said, finally allowing a small frown to cross his face. I'm starting to get the feeling that maybe, possibly, this might be more dangerous than you guys initially let on. Now he gets it, Clix muttered. But, Tank continued, I already volunteered, and backing out now would be kind of embarrassing. Plus, honestly, how much worse can it be than my last performance review? Torture. Tank, Zorb said desperately, your last performance review didn't involve potential disembowelment. You didn't read the fine print. Instructor Vex cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention back to him. Mr. Rodriguez, are you certain you wish to proceed with this assessment? I am required to inform you that you have the right to withdraw your volunteer status, though doing so would result in automatic failure of the course. Tank considered this for about 3 seconds. So, my choices are definitely fail, or probably get eaten but maybe pass? That's an accurate summary. Well then, Tank said, clapping his hands together with the kind of determined optimism usually reserved for people about to do something spectacularly stupid. When do we start? And please tell me the cafeteria stays open late, because I'm definitely going to want a really good meal before this, you know, just in case it's my last one. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Nala's crystalline structure making what sounded suspiciously like a whimper. 3 hours later, Tank stood at the entrance to Combat Arena 7, wearing what the Academy generously called standard protective equipment, and what Tank was pretty sure was just regular clothing with extra buckles. The energy weapon felt solid in his hands, though he noticed the power cell was only rated for about 15 minutes of continuous use. Either the Academy was very confident in his quick victory, or they were being economical with ammunition for the inevitable cleanup. Through the reinforced transparasteel windows, he could see his classmates arranged in what looked like theater seating for a disaster movie. Zorb had gone completely transparent with stress. Nala was cycling through colors so rapidly she looked like a living disco ball. Clix had assumed what Tank was pretty sure was a prayer position, though it was hard to tell with the whole insect thing. "Final equipment check," announced Vex through the intercom, his voice carrying the professional courtesy of someone about to watch a car crash in slow motion. "Energy weapon. Shot. Personal shield generator." Tank looked at the device clipped to his belt, which was making concerning beeping noises. "It's making sounds. Is that good or bad?" "It means it's working. Emergency beacon?" "The big red button that says, 'Help, I'm being eaten'?" "That's the one." Tank took a deep breath and looked through the arena's entrance at what lay beyond. The Dreadmauler's containment area was designed to look like a natural environment, complete with rocky outcroppings, sparse vegetation, and mood lighting that screamed, atmospheric horror movie set. He couldn't see the creature yet, but he could hear it moving around, and it sounded like someone dragging a refrigerator across a gravel parking lot. "Any last-minute advice?" Tank asked. "Try not to die," Vex replied helpfully. "It creates paperwork." "Great. Really feeling the support here." The arena doors opened with a hydraulic hiss that sounded remarkably like the galaxy sighing in resignation. Tank stepped through, and the doors sealed behind him with the kind of finality usually reserved for tomb entrances and bad life decisions. The arena was bigger than it had looked from outside, roughly the size of a football field, but with more rocks and considerably more ominous shadows. The air smelled like something between a zoo and a very old leather jacket. Tank activated his shield generator, which hummed to life and surrounded him in a faint blue glow that was either reassuring or made him look like a very obvious target. "Okay, big guy," Tank called out to the apparently empty arena. "I know you're in here somewhere. How about we get this over with? I've got a history exam tomorrow and I really can't afford to spend all day being digested." Something moved in the shadows near the far wall, something large. The dread mauler of Proxima 9 emerged from behind a rock formation like a nightmare that had been hitting the gym. The holographic projection hadn't done it justice. In person, it was the kind of creature that made you understand why early humans had invented religion. 12 feet of obsidian-scaled death machine, with claws that looked like they'd been forged in whatever factory made industrial mining equipment. Its eyes were the color of fresh blood, with the intelligence of a chess grandmaster who'd learned the game by eating other chess grandmasters. "Well," Tank said, his voice only slightly higher than usual, "you are definitely bigger in person." The creature tilted its massive head, studying Tank with the focus of a predator trying to decide which part to eat first. Its nostrils flared, probably analyzing his scent for signs of fear, weakness, or marinade potential. Tank did what any reasonable human would do when faced with an apex predator designed by evolution's most violent committee. He looked for cover. The rocky outcroppings were positioned strategically around the arena, creating natural barriers and hiding spots. Tank made his way toward the nearest one, keeping his energy weapon raised and his eyes on the Dreadmauler, who was following his movement with the patient interest of someone watching an appetizer walk around the plate. "You know," Tank said conversationally, because talking helped him think and silence was terrifying. "I bet you're used to prey that either runs away screaming or tries to fight you head-on, like some kind of honor-bound idiot." The creature's head tilted further, as if it was actually listening. But here's the thing about humans, Tank continued, reaching the cover of a boulder and crouching behind it. We're not particularly fast, and we're definitely not particularly strong, but we are absolutely, categorically, stubbornly persistent. We're the species that invented the phrase, "Hold my beer and watch this." The dread mauler began moving toward him with the fluid grace of something that had never met a problem it couldn't solve with teeth. Tank waited until the creature was close enough that he could smell its breath, which was like a combination of sulfur and expired meat, then did something the beast had probably never experienced in 2 centuries of academy training exercises. He threw a rock at its face. Not the energy weapon, not some advanced tactical maneuver. A rock. A plain, ordinary, gravity-assisted chunk of arena landscaping. The rock bounced off the creature's armored snout with a sound like a baseball hitting a brick wall. The dread mauler stopped, blinked all 4 of its eyes, and made a sound that was part roar and part confused question mark. "Yeah, that's right," Tank said, already moving to a new position while the creature was processing this unprecedented experience. "Nobody ever threw rocks at you before, did they? All those fancy warriors with their elegant combat techniques and their sophisticated strategies, but nobody ever just chucked a rock and ran away like a 10-year-old with a slingshot." Through the observation windows, Tank could hear muffled sounds of distress from his classmates, probably Zorb having some kind of tentacle-based panic attack. The dread mauler shook its head and resumed its approach, but Tank could see something different in its eyes now. Confusion. This wasn't following any of the behavioral patterns it had learned from previous encounters. Tank threw another rock. This one hit the creature square in what was probably its equivalent of a forehead. The beast made the confused question mark sound again, louder this time. "See, the problem with being an apex predator," Tank explained, scrambling over a fallen log while the creature tried to figure out what was happening to its carefully orchestrated hunting routine, "is that you get used to things being afraid of you. You develop patterns, expectations. You probably have a whole psychological profile worked out for how prey is supposed to behave." The dread mauler lunged at Tank's previous position, but Tank was already gone, having rolled behind another outcropping. The creature's claws scraped against stone with a sound like nails on the galaxy's largest chalkboard. "But I'm not prey," Tank continued, his voice echoing around the arena in a way that made it hard for the creature to pinpoint his exact location. "I'm from a species that figured out how to kill mammoths with pointy sticks and bad attitudes. We're persistence hunters. We don't give up. We don't run away. We just keep being annoying until the problem solves itself." Tank popped up from behind a different rock and threw another stone. This one hit the creature in what might have been its shoulder. The dread mauler spun around, clearly frustrated by this deviation from standard predator-prey protocols. "You're built for fighting, warriors," Tank observed, now moving in a wide circle around the arena's perimeter. "Big, dramatic confrontations where you can use all that natural weaponry and intimidation factor. But what happens when someone refuses to be intimidated? What happens when your opponent treats you like an oversized pest instead of an engine of destruction?" The creature was beginning to show signs of actual confusion. It kept turning in circles, trying to predict where Tank would appear next, but Tank's movements didn't follow any logical pattern because they weren't based on military training or tactical doctrine. They were based on the time-honored human tradition of making it up as you go along and hoping for the best. Tank realized he was actually enjoying himself. Not the mortal terror part, that was still pretty awful, but the problem-solving aspect. The challenge of treating this legendary killing machine like a particularly difficult puzzle that could be solved with creativity and stubbornness. "You know what your real weakness is?" Tank asked, emerging from cover just long enough to lob another rock before disappearing again. "You're too smart. You're trying to understand what I'm doing instead of just reacting. You're looking for patterns that don't exist." The dread mauler had had enough. It reared back on its hind legs and let out a roar that probably registered on seismographs in neighboring star systems. The sound was designed to freeze prey with terror, to shut down higher brain functions, and leave victims helpless. Tank's response was to throw a rock at the creature's open mouth. The rock disappeared down the beast's throat, and the roar turned into a surprised coughing sound. The dread mauler looked genuinely offended, as if Tank had violated some ancient agreement about how these encounters were supposed to go. "Sorry," Tank called out. "Probably should have warned you I was aiming for the mouth. That's got to be uncomfortable." The creature was now making sounds Tank had never heard before, somewhere between angry and bewildered. It was clear that in 2 centuries of academy training exercises, nobody had ever treated the dread mauler with such casual disrespect. Tank checked his chronometer, 7 minutes down, 3 to go. He was actually going to survive this. The Dread Mauler, meanwhile, had apparently decided that if traditional hunting methods weren't working, it was time to try brute force. It began systematically destroying Tank's hiding spots, smashing rock formations with its claws and tail, eliminating cover with the methodical efficiency of a demolition crew. Okay, Tank muttered, watching his options disappear one boulder at a time. Time for Plan B. Unfortunately, he didn't actually have a Plan B. He'd been making this up as he went along, and now he was running out of things to make up. The Dread Mauler had cleared most of the arena, and was now stalking toward Tank's last remaining hiding spot with the satisfaction of a predator who had finally figured out how to solve an annoying puzzle. Tank looked at his energy weapon, then at the approaching creature, then at the observation windows where his classmates were watching with expressions of impending grief. Well, he said to himself, when in doubt, do something stupid. Tank stepped out from behind his cover, walked directly toward the Dread Mauler, and sat down cross-legged in the middle of the arena. The creature stopped so suddenly it nearly tripped over its own feet. It looked down at Tank, then around the arena, then back at Tank, clearly trying to process this latest deviation from established protocol. Tank looked up at the massive predator and smiled. You know what? I'm tired of running around. How about we just sit here for the next 3 minutes and call it a draw? You don't eat me, I don't throw any more rocks at you, and we both pretend this was a meaningful educational experience. The Dread Mauler tilted its head almost 90 degrees, like a confused dog trying to understand a particularly complex trick. They sat there for exactly 2 minutes and 47 seconds, predator and prey, locked in what was probably the most anticlimactic staring contest in Academy history. When the timer reached 0 and the arena doors opened, Tank stood up, dusted off his uniform, and walked calmly toward the exit. The Dread Mauler watched him go, still looking confused. Thanks for not eating me, Tank called back over his shoulder. Same time next week? The creature made what might have been a thoughtful rumbling sound. Tank had survived the Dread Mauler of Proxima 9 not through superior combat skills or tactical brilliance, but by refusing to play by the rules of a game that had been rigged for 2 centuries. Sometimes the most human solution was the most effective one. Just be too weird to predict. Tank emerged from Combat Arena 7 to find his classmates arranged in what could only be described as a receiving line for someone returning from the dead. Zorb had regained some color in his tentacles but was still translucent enough that Tank could see the wall behind him. Nala's crystalline structure was stuck on a shade of blue that her species probably didn't have a name for because it had never been experienced before. Clicks was making clicking sounds that resembled either applause or the noise a broken processor makes right before it explodes. So, Tank said, unclipping his shield generator and handing it back to Instructor Vex. How'd I do? The silence stretched on long enough for Tank to wonder if everyone had suddenly developed a collective case of laryngitis. Finally, Zorb managed to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. You sat down. Yeah, seemed like the thing to do at the time. You sat down in front of the Dread Mauler of Proxima 9. Well, I was getting tired of all the running around. Plus, my feet were starting to hurt in these boots. Nala's structure flashed between 17 different colors before settling on something that looked like bewildered respect. Tank, do you understand what just happened in there? I survived 10 minutes without getting eaten, dismembered, or psychologically broken, which I believe were the stated objectives. Tank looked around at the group. Did I miss something? Because you all look like you just witnessed someone juggle antimatter while riding a unicycle. Then, Instructor Vex said slowly, consulting his datapad with the expression of someone checking to make sure reality was still functioning properly, was the most unconventional approach to combat assessment in Academy history. Is that good or bad? It's unprecedented. In 200 years of training exercises, no one has ever defeated the Dread Mauler through the strategic application of... Vex paused, clearly struggling with the terminology. Sitting down and having a conversation. Technically, it was more of a monologue, Tank corrected. The Dread Mauler didn't contribute much to the dialogue, though it was a very good listener. Clix's mandibles stopped clicking entirely, which Tank had learned meant the insectoid was processing something that didn't compute with his worldview. You threw rocks at it. It seemed rude not to. It was trying so hard to be intimidating. You threw rocks, Clix repeated, at the most feared predator in known space. Eli were good rocks. Nice weight distribution, adequate aerodynamics. I used to have pretty decent aim in Little League. A student from the back of the group, one of the cactus people Tank had never really gotten to know, raised what might have been a hand. What's Little League? Human childhood ritual involving the strategic throwing of spherical objects at designated targets while small humans run in predetermined patterns, Tank explained helpfully. Excellent training for rock throwing accuracy, as it turns out. Zorb's tentacles began writhing in what Tank recognized as his thinking pattern. But the psychological warfare aspect, the way you completely disrupted its behavioral expectations, that was actually brilliant tactical innovation. Was it? Tank looked genuinely surprised. I just figured if something that big and scary was trying to eat me, I might as well make the experience as confusing as possible for everyone involved. You realize, Nala said, her crystalline structure now settling into what Tank was pretty sure was admiration green, that you've just revolutionized combat theory? The entire academy curriculum is based on confronting threats with superior force, advanced technology, or tactical superiority. You defeated a legendary predator with psychological unpredictability and basic geology. Basic geology? The rocks, Tank. You weaponized sedimentary deposits. Instructor Vex cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. Mr. Rodriguez, I find myself in the unusual position of having to completely reevaluate both your final grade and potentially our entire approach to combat training. So did I pass? You didn't just pass. You've created a new category. Vex made notes on his datapad with the concentrated focus of someone documenting a natural phenomenon. I'm provisionally calling it Applied Chaos Theory with Mineral Projectiles. That sounds way more impressive than what actually happened. What actually happened, said a voice from the back of the group, is that you proved humans might be completely insane. Tank turned to see who had spoken and found himself facing a reptilian student he'd barely interacted with during their time at the academy. The creature's scales had shifted to what Tank assumed was either respect color or, holy crap, what did we just witness color? I prefer to think of it as creatively problem-solving, Tank replied. Insane sounds so negative. You treated the dread mauler like it was a large, confused pet, the reptilian continued. You spoke to it conversationally while pelting it with rocks and then invited it to have a peaceful time. When you put it like that, it does sound a little weird. A little weird? Zorb's voice had climbed back into the upper registers of disbelief. Tank, weird is using an unconventional weapon or trying an unexpected tactical maneuver. What you did was, he paused, searching for adequate terminology. What you did was treat a legendary engine of destruction like an annoying neighbor who plays music too loud. Tank considered this. That's actually a pretty good analogy. Sometimes you can't force someone to stop being a problem. Sometimes you just have to be a bigger, more confusing problem until they give up and leave you alone. And that works for humans? Works for everything, really. Persistence plus weirdness equals eventual success. It's practically our species' motto. Instructor Vex had been unusually quiet during this exchange, but now he stepped forward with an expression Tank couldn't quite read. Mr. Rodriguez, are you aware that your approach today has solved a problem we've been struggling with for decades? Which problem is that? How to prepare cadets for encounters with truly unpredictable threats. Every simulation, every training exercise, every combat scenario we've developed is based on logical, predictable behavioral patterns. We've been teaching students to fight enemies that follow rules. And real enemies don't follow rules? Real enemies, Vex said with something that might have been approval, are exactly as chaotic and unreasonable as what you demonstrated today. You've accidentally created the most effective training methodology for dealing with unknown variables. Tank looked around at his classmates, who were all staring at him with expressions ranging from newfound respect to existential confusion. So what you're telling me, Tank said slowly, is that being weird and stubborn and throwing rocks at things is actually a legitimate military strategy. Apparently, Vex replied, it's the most effective military strategy we've seen in 2 centuries. Tank considered this information. In that case, do you have any other supposedly impossible training exercises I could try? Because honestly, this was way more fun than studying tactical theory. The look of absolute horror that crossed every alien face in the room was probably visible from space. Tank, Zorb said carefully, when you say more fun, I mean, once you get past the whole potential death thing, it was basically just a puzzle with teeth. And I like puzzles. Plus, the Dreadmauler seemed like it was getting bored with the same old routine. I probably did it a favor by mixing things up. You want to do this again? Nala's crystalline structure was cycling through colors so fast she looked like a living strobe light. Well, not with the same creature. That would be repetitive. But I bet there are other supposedly unbeatable challenges around here that just need someone to approach them from a completely different angle. Instructor Vex made a note on his datapad that looked suspiciously like it might say, recommend immediate psychological evaluation, or possibly, nominate for advanced placement in everything. Mr. Rodriguez, Vex said finally, I believe we may need to design an entirely new curriculum around your particular talents. Sounds awesome. Can I name it? What would you call it? Tank grinned, and for the first time since arriving at the academy, he felt like he'd found exactly where he belonged. Advanced applied human nonsense, he said, with a minor in strategic confusion and a specialization in making things up as you go along. From somewhere deep in the academy's archives, the dread mauler of Proxima 9 made a sound that might have been laughter. Word had already begun to spread throughout the station about the human who had defeated the legendary beast not through superior firepower or tactical brilliance, but by being so fundamentally weird that the creature had given up trying to understand what was happening. By the end of the week, Tank had a new nickname, the Confuser. By the end of the month, he had a line of students from 17 different species asking him to teach them how to think like a human. And somewhere in the depths of space, on planets where the galaxy's most dangerous creatures lurked, predators began having nightmares about small bipedal beings who threw rocks and asked uncomfortable questions and refused to be intimidated by anything that made sense. The humans, it turned out, were definitely the crazy ones in the galaxy. And that, as it happened, was exactly what the galaxy needed.